On a routine mission at the edge of Terran space, a small crew aboard a scout ship encounters an anomaly. Something is watching them from beyond the ship's viewport. At first, they dismiss it as a trick of the light, but the strange occurrences increase. As they move deeper into uncharted space, the feeling of being stalked intensifies, and they realize the reflections in the windows are no longer their own. Something is out there, and it knows they're coming. The cold light of the ship's emergency systems cast a harsh glow over the cockpit. The small vessel, the Elysium, floated in the stillness of space, silent except for the faint hum of the ship's minimal systems. The distant stars flickered through the viewport, twinkling like cold, indifferent eyes. Inside, the crew was tense, each one trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over the ship. Commander Isaac Steele ran his fingers across the touchscreen in front of him, adjusting the navigational coordinates. The silence in the cockpit felt unnerving, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. He glanced around at his crew. Sergeant Olivia Grant was seated at the weapons console, staring out at the stars with a faraway look in her eyes. Private Felix Rojas was working on the communication systems, tapping away at his console. Everyone was focused, but Steele could sense the tension in the air. "Report?" Steele's voice broke the quiet, a calm but deliberate question. "We're still on course, Commander," Rojas replied, glancing up briefly from his console. "No anomalies. Everything checks out." Grant didn't respond immediately, but her eyes shifted toward the viewport again, her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass. Steele could see the reflection of the distant stars in her dark eyes, and the way her fingers twitched nervously on the console. Something was bothering her, and he knew it wasn't just the mission. "Olivia?" Steele pressed, noticing the tension in her posture. "I thought I saw something out there," she said finally, her voice low. Steele raised an eyebrow. "Saw something? Like what?" "I'm not sure," Grant muttered, her eyes narrowing as she stared back out at the viewport. "It's probably nothing. I thought I saw a shadow or movement." A brief silence followed, and then Steele stood, crossing to the viewport. His boots made a soft clink against the metal floor, the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. He gazed out at the vastness of space, his eyes scanning the area where Grant had been looking. The stars were far and few between, their cold light twinkling across the endless black. But there was nothing else, no sign of movement, no anomaly, just the vacuum of space. "You're probably just tired," Steele said after a beat. "It's a long journey, and we've been out here for days. If there's nothing on the scans, it's nothing." Grant didn't respond at first. She just kept staring out at the void, her face drawn in deep thought. After a few moments, she slowly turned away, but Steele could tell she wasn't fully convinced. "We'll keep an eye out," Steele said, trying to reassure her. He returned to his seat at the command console, feeling the weight of the silence pressing on him. It wasn't just the stars outside that made him uneasy. There was something in the air, a quiet, invisible pressure that seemed to creep into his chest with each passing second. His thoughts were interrupted by Rojas's voice. "Commander, we've got a minor issue with the forward scanner," Rojas reported, his fingers moving across the console. "It's fluctuating, probably just a minor glitch, but I'd recommend checking the logs." "Noted," Steele replied, giving the order to run a diagnostic on the forward scanner. As Rojas worked on recalibrating the sensor systems, Grant turned her attention back to the viewport, her expression unreadable. She stood, crossing to the console near the window, her gaze intense. "What's wrong?" Steele asked, sensing the sudden shift in her demeanor. Grant didn't answer at first. Then her voice came in a breathless whisper. "Look, it's there again." Steele's stomach clenched as he looked at her. "What are you talking about? There's nothing." But then Steele saw it. In the reflection on the glass, there was something moving, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, he thought it was just the distortion of the viewport, the reflection of the stars playing tricks on his eyes. But then it moved again, too deliberate to be a trick of light. A shadow, no, a figure, was reflected in the glass, and it wasn't one of them. It was tall, dark, and formless. For a brief second it seemed to be standing just outside the ship, hovering at the edge of the viewport. But when Steele turned to look, there was nothing, just the vast emptiness of space. "Did you see that?" Grant asked, her voice trembling. Steele didn't answer. His pulse quickened as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned back to the viewport, eyes scanning the area outside the ship. There was nothing there, no sign of anything that shouldn't be. "I didn't see anything," Steele said slowly, but the words didn't comfort him. Not in the slightest. Maybe it's just a reflection," Steele added quickly, trying to rationalize it. "We're not picking up any signals on the scanners, and there's no—" The figure moved again in the reflection, its form flickering with the light. "That's not a reflection," Grant said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and terror. "It's watching us." Steele's heart raced. He could feel his grip tightening on the armrests of his chair, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. There had to be a logical explanation, but every instinct he had was screaming that something was wrong, deeply wrong. He stood up again, moving quickly to the navigation console. "Rojas, take the controls. Head towards the nearest system. We need to get out of here." Rojas didn't argue, but Steele could see the hesitation in his eyes. The rest of the crew was tense, too, their gaze flicking nervously toward the viewport. The reflection, the thing outside, was still there, lingering just at the edges of their vision. Without another word, Steele turned to the crew and gave the order. "Set course for the nearest Terran border. Get us out of here." But as they moved into position, Steele couldn't shake the feeling that they were already being followed. They thought it was mercy. It wasn't. The silence aboard the Elysium was deafening. After the unsettling encounter with the shadow outside the viewport, the crew found themselves unable to speak. The room was heavy with tension. Every creak of the ship, every flicker of the lights heightened their unease. The mysterious figure, if it was a figure at all, had appeared again in the reflection. But when Steele turned to look, it was always gone, vanishing as if it never existed. Steele tried to focus on the mission, his mind working in overdrive to push the unsettling images away. But each time he looked out the viewport, his eyes would inevitably be drawn to the space beyond, to the shifting shadows, the deepening darkness that seemed to stretch outward, waiting. "Commander?" Grant's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "What's going on? What did we see?" Steele didn't look at her immediately, afraid that the moment he took his eyes off the control panel, the shadow would appear again, mocking him. Instead, he continued to work the navigation console, his fingers moving mechanically. "I don't." "No, Sergeant," Steele replied, his voice steady but strained. "We're just a few days out from the Terran border. We'll get there. We'll figure it out." "Get there? What do we even do when we get there?" Grant snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "You can't just pretend nothing's wrong. Something is out there." Steele finally turned his gaze to her, locking eyes with her. He could see the fear in her expression, the same fear that was creeping into his own heart. But he couldn't show it. Not now. Not when they needed to stay focused. "Right now, we keep heading to the border. There's no signal from anything out there, no movement on the sensors. Whatever this is, it's not a threat we can engage with yet, but we have to stay calm." Grant opened her mouth to argue, but then paused, as if the weight of his words had finally registered. She closed her mouth and turned back to the viewport. The ship felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around them. The vastness of space, once a source of awe, now seemed oppressive, as though it was taunting them with its cold indifference. "Commander!" Rojas spoke up from his position at the communications console. His voice was strained, high-pitched, as though his nerves were getting the best of him. "You should see this. I'm getting something on the communications frequency." Steele looked over, his heart sinking. What kind of signal? It's weird, sir. It's not structured. Like anything we've ever encountered, it's almost like a pulse. I can't make sense of it. Steele's mind raced. A pulse. They had encountered strange signals on their deep space missions before, but nothing that had ever felt like this. He walked over to Rojas's console, leaning in to get a better look. Rojas was tapping at the console, trying to isolate the source, but the signal was fluctuating erratically. Each pulse seemed to create a strange distortion in the static, like someone or something was trying to communicate but couldn't quite make it through. "Can you triangulate the source?" Steele asked, trying to focus despite the unease that churned in his stomach. "I'm trying, sir," Rojas replied, his fingers dancing across the console. But the more he worked, the more chaotic the signals became. "I've never seen anything like this before." Steele knew that the communication systems should be running perfectly. The Elysium wasn't just any scout ship. It was one of the best in the fleet, equipped with top-of-the-line technology. If the communications were malfunctioning, it meant something was messing with their equipment, something powerful enough to distort their systems. "Is it coming from the planet?" Grant asked, her voice tense as she turned from the viewport to look at Rojas. "No," Rojas said, shaking his head. It's coming from outside the ship, beyond the stars. But it's not on any known frequency." Grant's face tightened, and she exchanged a glance with Steele. Something was out there, something that wasn't on their radar, wasn't in their databases, and now it was interfering with their very communications. And it was getting worse. "Sir," Rojas said, his voice rising in panic, "the signal's coming. Closer. It's getting stronger." Steele took a deep breath, fighting the gnawing fear that threatened to overtake him. He couldn't let it. Not now. "Are we still on course to the border?" "Yes, Commander," Rojas said, though his voice was less certain. "But I don't know how much longer we'll stay undetected. If this signal is real, we're not alone." Steele felt a chill go down his spine. Not alone. The words echoed in his mind over and over, as though they were a premonition of what was to come. "Close the communication systems, Rojas," Steele ordered. "We don't need any more distractions." Rojas hesitated but obeyed, shutting down the erratic signal with a few quick taps. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but it didn't last long. A shadow flickered on the viewport again. This time it was more than just a trick of the light. It was clearer, more defined. A shape moved across the glass, too slow to be natural, too deliberate. Steele's breath caught in his throat. The reflection wasn't a distortion of space. It was real. "Look," Grant whispered, her voice barely audible. "There it is again." Steele's eyes snapped to the viewport, and there it was. The same shadow from before, standing outside. Their ship, lingering just beyond their reach. It was tall, dark, and impossible to understand. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form shifting like it wasn't truly part of their world. And then, in the reflection of the glass, Steele saw something that made his blood run cold. There were more of them. Shadows, figures all standing just outside their ship, watching, waiting. "We have to get out of here," Steele said, his voice tight. "Now!" Grant stepped back, her face pale. What is it, Commander? What's out there?" Steele didn't have an answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that they weren't alone anymore. Something was out there, and it was watching them. "Rojas, plot a course," Steele ordered, his voice hard. "Now!" But before Rojas could respond, the lights flickered, and the ship shook, throwing everyone off balance. A loud thud echoed through. The hull and the shadows outside seemed to stir. "We're being boarded," Steele whispered under his breath. "Get to the weapons console, now!" And that was when the real terror began. They thought it was mercy. It wasn't. The ship lurched again, this time with greater force. Steele braced himself against the console as the Elysium shook, the overhead lights flickering wildly before going out completely, plunging the cockpit into darkness. The emergency systems kicked in with a low hum, casting an eerie, dim light across the room. "Shit, what was that?" Rojas exclaimed, his voice high with panic. "Stay calm," Steele barked, his eyes scanning the dark room. "We need to assess the damage. Olivia, get to the weapons console. Felix, see if we can regain control of the ship." The crew sprang into action, but the sense of disarray was palpable. It wasn't just a shake, a rattle from the ship's frame. It was as though something external was deliberately shaking them, pushing them closer to the edge. "Something's messing with the systems," Rojas shouted, frantically tapping at his console. "I can't get a lock on anything. The communication systems are scrambled again." Steele stepped forward, his face tight with concentration. "The signal," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's not just interference. Something's forcing us off course." Grant moved toward the viewport, her face illuminated by the pale light from the emergency lamps. "I'm telling you, Commander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's still out there. I saw it again." Steele joined her, staring out into the void. He could see the reflection on the glass, the shifting shadows outside, but they seemed even closer now. They weren't just lingering. They were circling. Their movements were too deliberate, too controlled to be natural. "Are you seeing this?" Grant asked, turning to Steele, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I see it," Steele replied, his voice cold. "But that's not the worst of it." He pointed to the viewport. The reflection of the shadows now stark against the dark expanse of space. At first, he thought it was just a trick of light, something they could dismiss. But now, the shadow figures were visible even without the reflection. Their shapes, dark and formless, seemed to shift with the flicker of the lights. "We're not alone," Steele said, his voice quiet but steady. "Whatever it is outside, it's been following us." "We need to leave now," Rojas urged, his fingers flying over the console. "We can't stay here. I've lost control of the ship's navigational systems. We're adrift." The words hit Steele like a punch to the gut. They were drifting in space, vulnerable to whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking them. And they had no way to defend themselves, no way to fight back. The emergency lights blinked again, casting fleeting shadows over the crew as they huddled together in the darkened cockpit. Steele could hear the faint scraping noise from the walls, growing louder by the second. It was as if someone, was moving just beneath the surface of the ship. "Get us moving, Felix," Steele ordered, desperation creeping into his voice for the first time. "I can't," Rojas said, his hands trembling over the console. "The controls, they're malfunctioning. It's like the ship itself is resisting." Steele's heart pounded in his chest. The ship wasn't just malfunctioning, it was being controlled, manipulated from the outside. "Commander," Grant whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not just out there anymore, it's inside." Steele turned to her, his eyes wide with realization. The shadows had crossed into their world. The thing, whatever it was, had breached their ship, and now it was coming for them. He turned back to the viewport, staring at the shadows outside. They were closer now, right at the edge of the ship's hull, their presence undeniable. "We can't escape," Steele said grimly. "We're trapped." As if in response, the ship lurched again, and the emergency systems failed. Darkness consumed them. They thought it was mercy. It wasn't. The Elysium was silent now, the hum of the emergency systems their only company. The crew stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the viewport, where the shadows outside had multiplied, looming in. A dark, unnatural formation. Something had crossed the threshold, something beyond their comprehension, and it was no longer just a threat. It was an inevitability. Steele's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. There was no way out. The ship was adrift, its systems sabotaged, its weapons useless. They were sitting targets in the middle of space, surrounded by the unknown. "We're not leaving this ship alive," Grant said quietly, her voice strained. She had moved to the viewport, her eyes fixed on the figures that hovered just outside. Her voice trembled. "It's happening. Whatever it is, it's here. It's already in us." Rojas stepped forward, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Commander, we've lost power to everything. The weapons, the navigation, everything's gone. We're stuck. There's nothing we can do." Collins clenched his fists, the weight of their impending doom settling heavily on his chest. But then his thoughts shifted, a flicker of clarity in the chaos. "We still have the comms," he said suddenly, looking at Rojas. "Can you at least get us one final transmission?" Rojas shook his head. "No, sir. They're blocking everything. We can't even send a distress signal. Then what's left?" Steele muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Without warning, the ship jolted forward, and the crew was thrown into the walls. The viewport glass vibrated as if it would crack. The shadows outside were no longer standing still. They were coming for them. The last thing Steele saw before everything went black was the unmistakable figure of a shadow moving against the viewport. A figure that was not human, not even of this world. And then the feed cut. The silence of space swallowed them. They thought it was mercy. It wasn't.